as you guys have heard before, I was here at the Institute for about 6 or 7 months back in 2014, 2015. After my contract in Cologne has finished, and I was looking for some grants to continue writing my PhD. And the book is it's based on my PhD, but you guys all know how it works with academia and then publishing a book. The PhD is a bit more extensive and it has theory in there and methodology stuff. Publishing house is not really interested, so this is more like the hardcore empirics of that PhD research of mine. As you guys have heard, I've done my PhD at 2 universities, University of Cologne in Germany and the University of Edinburgh in the United Kingdom, which was a fun project. The University of Cologne applied for it with the European Commission at their research framework program. You guys are aware, in Europe with all that Erasmus, we have like we have these master programs, double degree master programs, but not really double degree PhD programs. And this was, I guess, one of the first ones. And the idea was that you get one PhD, but issued by 2 universities. The program had 3 universities: Cologne, Prague, and Edinburgh. And in addition to that, a couple of research think tanks spread all over Europe, where we were supposed to work for a couple of months in order to also get some professional experience in the policy area, not only working with academia. So I was based in Brussels for a few months at the think tank there, dealing with reports for the European Parliament, but mainly based in Cologne. And then I also got my PhD issued by the University of Edinburgh, which was, in the end, a fun experience, because although they try to bring together these different kind of institutions and different kind of regulations, in the end you have to deal with 2 universities and 2 departments, and I had to submit 2 different PhD versions, which was quite...
In 2 languages?
In English, but you know, it's only like basic stuff like the format I had to change, which then of course screws up the entire PhD. So like it was a fun journey, but as I said before, I wrote extensive parts of my PhD here at that very building and different libraries here at university, or also at Shattuck Avenue. So a lot of work was done here. I had a great time back there. As I said, a couple of affiliations. I think the one I'm most proud of is probably the last one, the Arctic Institute, which I explained before. Started as a blog in 2011, made by a couple of PhD students. And we thought, okay, why not starting a blog where we could easily publish ideas, thoughts we have about the Arctic or our research as such, without going through the entire hassle of academic journals. And over the years it became bigger and bigger, and we have some small funding through helping organizing some conferences. We have a nice Twitter account. I'm currently developing a news app, and yeah, we became a non-profit a couple of years ago in the US, and now trying to offer more and more, or to become a platform for young students to publish their work on Arctic issues and to give them a platform. But my main employer is the Heinrich Center in Bude, where I'm currently employed as a project manager for a project that deals with regional development in both Alaska and North Norway, when it comes to what's now hip and sexy, a blue economy and smart communities. And yeah, we're trying to, it's sponsored by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Norway, and we try to see if there are similarities in the approaches both Alaska and North Norway take when it comes to blue economy. So that's what I will be doing the next 3 years. So yeah, what I'm here for today is the European Union and their Arctic policy. And I don't know how, we have one Arctic expert here and we have a Norwegian here, but I don't know how much you know about the Arctic. When I started to deal with Arctic issues, that was in 2007. I wrote my master thesis for the University of Vienna on Norway's energy policy in the high north, and the year 2007 was somehow a tipping point when it comes to Arctic issues to some extent.
Was Peter Schweitzer there then?
Sorry?
Peter Schweitzer, was he there then at your university?
Which one?
Peter Schweitzer.
Peter Schweitzer, yeah, but
friend of mine
yeah, okay.
Alaska.
I don't know him, but I know the name. He's an anthropologist.
Still
but,
very active.
yeah, exactly. So back in 2007, you had this infamous flag planting You may have heard of, or not have heard of, a Russian submarine planted a Russian flag at the North Pole, on the bottom of the continental shelf of the North Pole, which of course dominated media in the month after, because the Russians are planting something and claiming the North Pole, although they cannot claim. There's a couple, there's a big story behind that. It was actually not a Russian submarine, it was actually a privately sponsored submarine by an Australian, I think, millionaire or something. But nevertheless, a Russian flag was planted, and some conflict over that claiming of the North Pole started. So that was in summer 2017. And at the same point, later that summer, in September 2017, the Arctic sea ice, for the very first time, well, not for the very first time, but there was a record in the Arctic sea ice decline, which now you have records every other year. But 2017 was the first big record, like with the entire sea ice melting and melting. And so 2017 was somehow a starting point for Arctic issues to appear a bit more on the global agenda. During my research, I found this nice comment by a Finnish scholar who once wrote that geopolitics of the Arctic return in circles or in waves. Every 10 years it kind of pops up again. And it seems like 2017 was one of these years with these two tipping points and these two incidents. And by coincidence, that was when I wrote my master thesis. And then kind of the interest into the Arctic developed. And then back in 2011, I got a chance to start at the University of Cologne at the Department for European Politics, European Union Politics. And I said, yeah, I'm happy to do a PhD, but only if I can do it on the Arctic and the EU in the Arctic. And my professor was quite surprised because, to put it frankly, the Arctic is not a hot topic in Europe. And he was wondering what I can actually do about that. And it was an interesting journey over all these years, because you had to constantly kind of defend what you're doing and why you focus on the Arctic and not on other issues of European foreign policy. Our entire program was more focused on EU foreign policy, and the Arctic is to some extent foreign policy for Europe, but to some extent it's not. You guys are aware of Norway, Finland and Sweden being EU member states. Then you have Norway and Iceland being connected to the European Union via the Economic Area Agreement. Then you have Greenland, who was part of the EU at some point until '85, or the European Community, and now it's not, but of course part of the Danish Kingdom. So EU Arctic policy is an interesting mix of internal and external policy, and they're kind of mingling. And so it was quite an interesting journey to write a PhD about that. And then the other idea I had when starting the PhD, the Arctic was all about geopolitics. You talked about narratives before, and what is geopolitics and what does it mean, and is it only geography that kind of influences foreign policy, or is it more? And I did some research, and I never found anything on EU geopolitics, or geopolitics from a European Union perspective, and at least in political science. And then I found it by coincidence when it comes to political geography or human geography, and they're dealing a bit with, or they have a critical stance, a critical approach to geopolitics. What is geopolitics? So it's not this direct connection between foreign policy, or not only this connection between foreign policy and geography, but it's more about narratives and how individuals and how a state, a country perceives geography as a tool for foreign policy as such. So, and then I tried to explain to a political scientist that I'd like to do some interdisciplinary approach and bring in some political geography, which eventually was possible, but it was, as I said before, a tricky journey, because it's more about constructivism and these kind of ideas behind critical geopolitics, and not really the hardcore approach of variables and theory and methodology. But nevertheless, I tried to explain the European Union's Arctic journey from that political geography perspective. And so in the end, it is a lot about geopolitics and EU geopolitics, and can you frame the EU from a foreign policy perspective? How can you argue that the EU is a geopolitical actor, which in a classic sense is a state like Russia or the US, or the military power, blah, 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 etc. But not the European Union, which, you know, as you guys know, doesn't have your own military and so on. So that was the entire, like, the starting point, the puzzle of my research. But before that, to give you a quick overview of actually what happened in the Arctic, so let's go back to that. What I want to talk about quickly is what is the Arctic actually for the EU? What happened in the past? A bit about the present, like what's the current situation when it comes to the Arctic policy making, but also in the relationship between the EU and its Arctic neighbors, but also between the EU and its Arctic member states. And then have a quick outlook what the future will bring to the EU and the Arctic. So as I mentioned before, although the Union's Arctic interest started a bit, what I said before, with these tipping points, also back in 2007, 2008, of course the EU always had a connection to the Arctic. The Arctic was similar to a southern neighborhood or to its eastern neighborhood. Also, there was some kind of a northern neighborhood where the European politicians or decision makers and the EU as such, or the European community before, had some kind of link with the region. And as I mentioned before, Greenland was part of the European community until '85, but then opted out. Nevertheless, in the 1990s, when this Arctic wave started, in the early 90s, this first Arctic wave, of course the EU also had an interest to be part of that and strengthen their presence. They established, or they were helped to establish, the so-called Barents Euro-Arctic Council, which is a regional organization in Northern Europe. And then, as you guys may know, Finland and Sweden became became EU members in '95, and shortly after, especially Finland argued that the EU should have a northern dimension and should have a distinct policy for its northern area, similar to what they did with the south and the east. This northern dimension, they had what one calls one particular Arctic window, so an idea to create a policy that even goes beyond the Arctic dimension, further north, and like trying to encapsulate the entire Arctic, circumpolar Arctic area. But that never really started until 2007, 2008. So the 90s was like a low-key, low-profile Arctic approach that you had, with no substantial Arctic awareness on what's actually happening up north. Of course, member states, Sweden and Finland, but to some extent that's it. And then, as I mentioned before, 2007, this climate change issue, the melting Arctic sea ice, plus what people then framed as geopolitics and the scramble of the Arctic, the new Cold War with new ship. I don't know how much you know about the Arctic. Maybe I should mention that as well. You know, the potential of new shipping routes up in the north, energy resources, especially gas in the European and Russian parts of the Arctic, but also some oil in Alaska that could bring. The Arctic could be a new energy resource. That was one of the stories told in 2007, 2008. There was this famous and widespread report survey by the EUs Geological Survey. I think it was back in 2005 or 6, which indicated, or which did a first survey on the Arctic energy potential, and they said there could be, or 1/3 of the undiscovered energy resources all over the world could be in the Arctic. And that was, of course, like a big media thing in the end. So all these things, that was 2007, 2008, when the Arctic became a bit hotter on a global perspective. And that's also when the EU started to become interested in the Arctic. And from the very beginning, I think the big story was up north. You mentioned jealousy and everything. It's like, what's the EU actually doing up north? What's happening now? Why are you interested up north? And are you can you name yourself an Arctic actor without being actually located in the Arctic? To some extent, that was a bit the discussion between Arctic states and Brussels. Nevertheless, the EU has always been an Arctic actor because some of its member states are Arctic states. It has a huge research footprint. Brussels, for 10 years now, they are spending a lot of money up north. They have, of course, an impact on Arctic climate. The EU is a heavy polluter, and we are aware that climate change is happening, and the Arctic is often framed as a canary in the coal mine when it comes to when it comes to climate change. So the EU has a heavy impact on change up there. It of course also has a huge impact when it comes to regulatory issues. EU laws affect the Arctic, affect Arctic regions, even if you're not part of the European Union. If ships want to pass the Arctic or want to traverse through the Arctic, if they are EU flagged, they have to adhere to EU laws. And then, of course, it's a key trade partner with some of the Arctic states, especially Russia and Norway, of course also Iceland. And it takes part in the several Arctic regimes that exist, for example, the Arctic Council. It's still not an observer to the Arctic Council. That's a long debate going on ever since I've started.
Is there a rivalry between the fact that China and Japan also want to belong to the Arctic Council?
Yes and no. I mean,
North America.
Yeah. To some extent, yes. I mean, if you talk to individuals at the European Commission, they are frustrated sometimes when it comes to why is everybody else accepted now as an observer, but not the European Union. I mean, we are so well connected to the Arctic. We're part of the Arctic due to our member states and due to the other points I mentioned here. Why is Singapore? Why is Japan? Why is China an observer to the Arctic Council, but not us? And I'll talk about that later. But then soon it's not about Arctic policy anymore. It's about geopolitics and global politics. And the reason why the European Union is not an observer to the Arctic Council yet is because of Crimea and Russia. Initially it was Canada declining EU observership due to the issue they had over seals, the products, seal products for the European market. This problem was solved between Canada and the European Union a couple of years ago, but now Russia is against EU observership because of the sanctions due to Crimea and Ukraine as such. So rivalry, yes, to some extent. But again, I'll talk about that a bit later. Also EU internally, I said before, the Arctic it's not a hot topic in Brussels. It's a few departments in the Commission deal with it, but only 1-2 people each. So it's compared to all the others, of course, other areas, the problems we're facing right now in Europe, it's Brexit, or is it Crimea, or is it the Balkans, when it comes to foreign policy issues, the Arctic is, of course, a relatively stable or extremely stable area where where the European Union has a good relationship with these Arctic states, especially with Norway or Iceland, which are European Arctic states but not EU member states. So it's not a hot topic in the diplomatic service in Brussels or in the Commission as such. Another thing I quickly want to mention, because I think sometimes that's forgotten in Europe, but it's also forgotten outside of Europe. When we talk about the EU and the European Union, we often tend to see the EU as one actor with one single voice, which is of course not a fact. Not right. I mean, you have 3 key institutions, and the Commission, the Council, where all the member states come together, and the European Parliament, and all these institutions, they follow their own agenda to some extent. Of course, they try to create some kind of European policy and European narrative and European approach to certain issues, but with the Commission being that supranational institution, of course the Council is that intergovernmental institution where the member states follow different kind of interests and try to push through their agenda. So I think that's, to some extent it became a key point in my book or in my PhD, but then sometimes you wonder it shouldn't be a fact. People should know. People deal with that issue. They should know that the EU is not simply the EU. It has many voices and many different competences. And if a member of the European Parliament says something about the Arctic, that does not mean that the entire EU wants that to happen in the Arctic. And that became, of course, for media it's quite easy to. I often write newspaper articles as well, and you have a different audience. You have a different kind of goal on who you want to reach, and then it becomes quite tempting to say the EU wants a moratorium on Arctic drilling, which the EU doesn't want, but maybe a member of the Green Party in the European Parliament wants that. So I think that's a key point to consider. So I mentioned before, many voices, many different institutions dealing with the Arctic in Brussels. Ever since that year 2007, 2008, the different institutions have issued 10 statements on the Arctic. I don't need to read them out, but the European Parliament has issued 4, the Commission, now together with the External Action Service, 3, and then the Council has also issued 3 statements. And what one can see over the last 10 years is what we often try to describe as a learning by doing approach. Like literally starting from that entire geopolitics hype in the year 2007, 2008, with a lot about like we have to take care of the Arctic to not become like a new center for global conflict, into a more like neutral definition of what the Arctic actually is, and how the European Union is linked to the Arctic, and what the European Union can bring to the Arctic, and how it can also profit from the Arctic, and how it can have a positive impact into regional development. From a more broader European foreign policy perspective, it developed starting from a very circumpolar Arctic attention into more like a regional attention. So that yes, the Arctic is a big area and is a big circumpolar area, but our key focus is on the European parts of the Arctic, like the European Arctic. Of course the member states, but of course also Greenland, Iceland and Norway, which are connected, as I mentioned before, to the EU, and of course also profit a lot from EU money when it comes to regional development issues or research programs. So over these 10 years they developed this broad foundation of what the EU actually wants to do in the Arctic, but what we often criticize, it's not yet a single Arctic policy. Like the idea is missing what the EU actually wants to do with the Arctic. To some extent there's an idea for the South and the East. The South was always like the entire Mediterranean area, and now with the refugee crisis and the migration crisis, how can we unfortunately become like this fortress Europe, which seems to be the narrative now. And there's also, of course, an idea to the east, like it was like, you know, these new member states over the last 10 years, and like bringing the former Cold War areas into the European Union. But for the Arctic and for the North, this was somehow, or is somehow still missing. What does the Arctic and what does the North actually mean for the European Union? Where should the EU go with their Arctic policy? Just quickly going, I already mentioned a lot. The key points, of course, when it comes to how do we see the Arctic and what do we want to do with our Arctic policy up north is the statements are clearly, of course, about climate change and how can we adapt, how can we help the communities or the regions up north adapting to climate change. It's about environmental protection. Economic opportunities, I mentioned before, is still existing, but not as strong as in the years before, especially in 2007 and 2008, when there was a lot of talk about new shipping routes through the Arctic, energy issues, energy resources up north. It's now a bit more, realistic, indicating we have all this opportunity up there, but for example, when it comes to shipping, you had the first container ship ever is currently about to traverse the Northern Sea Route, so north of Russia. The Danish company Maersk has sent a big container vessel, but that has been the first ever container vessel that's going through Arctic waters. So, and in the beginning there was a lot of talk, could the Arctic become the new Suez Canal, for example, which in my opinion, or in a lot of people's opinion, will not happen so far or at all, ever. Due to various reasons, but it could become a very interesting niche when it comes to economic development. And that this kind of niche idea also became obvious now in the EU's Arctic approach. Of course, a lot of talk is about sustainable development and sustainable regional development, so helping the communities up there not only to adapt to climate change, but also to become what they frame now center of innovations, blue economy centers, like not only profit from the resources when getting the resources, but also like working with the human potential and resource potential up there, and then like shipping it to European markets. And then, of course, a lot about climate change research and indigenous people issues up there, especially in Northern Europe and in Greenland. And I mentioned before, getting away from this entire circumpolar Arctic approach to a bit more a regional approach, like, okay, our neighborhood, our backyard is the European Arctic, and we should focus on that, and then only in a second step look at other issues when it comes to foreign policy of Russia and Alaska and Canada. Quickly, a few words to the relationship between the European Union and the Arctic states. Maybe should have mentioned it before, but as you can see, them a couple of Arctic states, or all the Arctic states, 8 Arctic states you have. You have, of course, Russia, the United States, Canada, Denmark, Greenland, Faroe Islands, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and Finland. And especially in the beginning, there was, as mentioned before, a lot of skepticism among the Arctic states of what's the EU actually doing up here? You know, you're a big actor. Why are you interested in the Arctic? And to put it bluntly, we want to keep the Arctic to ourselves. We are the Arctic states. We are responsible for Arctic development, and getting outsiders into that area was, I think, quite a challenge for the Arctic states over the last 10 years. As you mentioned before, you have a couple of new observers to the Arctic Council, which is the regional organization dealing with Arctic issues, not dealing with security policy, but with everything else, which was a key point in the founding documents of the Arctic Council, that security issues will not be covered by the Arctic Council, but only bilaterally with states. So the problems ever since the EU started to become interested in the Arctic was a lot about Arctic Council observer status, and the EU applied a couple of times and was rejected every time they applied for it. First, because of the ban on steel products they issued in 2009, if I'm not completely wrong, which had some impact on Canadian seal hunters, and then it became a domestic issue in Canada, and then Canada was, because of that domestic issue, against the EU becoming an observer to the Arctic Council, and then eventually became a topic or an issue in front of the WTO, but 2-3 years ago both countries were able to solve this issue, and now some sealed products are allowed to be sold at European markets. And now the other issue that's outstanding, or that's preventing you to become an observer, is, as I mentioned before, is Russia, and them being against observer status for the EU because of Crimea and Ukraine. So, the latest comment I heard from people in the External Action Services, they will not apply again until this issue is solved. And this became a matter of a bit frustration or jealousy. You mentioned before that we are that well connected to the Arctic, way better connected than other Asian states, for example, but we are not part of the Council and Arctic Council, and we should be.
Just explain. So the only totally Arctic nation is Greenland, and it's not a member. I mean, tell us a little more about Greenland's status.
Greenland status when it comes to the EU or when it comes to the Arctic Council?
Can it be an observer in the Arctic Council?
No, Greenland is Greenland is part of Denmark. So Denmark is representing Greenland at the Arctic Council. Because
so this is like saying Cornwall decided not to be in the European Union because it doesn't like something, and because Greenland did the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. So, but Greenland could become a member of the Arctic Council if they become independent at some point.
So at the moment they're caught, not a member of the European Union and not a member of the Arctic Council.
Yeah, but they are a member of...
Arctic nation as it were.
Yeah, but they are a member of the Arctic Council because they're part of Greenland, the Kingdom of Greenland. So the entire Danish approach to the Arctic is a Greenlandic approach.
So why didn't you color it part of Greenland on your map then?
I didn't create a map, so I copy pasted it. I don't know, but it's a good question, yeah.
Sorry.
No, but it's actually a really good point. I didn't think about that. Because are the Faroe Islands? They're neither colored. And they are also trying to be an Arctic entity. And we're also part of the kingdom of... But yeah, the 8 Arctic states that are represented in the Arctic Council are states. And Greenland is not a state yet. But I mean, there are ideas of becoming independent in the next, I don't know, decade. No, not decade, second century. You never know. I mean, yeah. Good point, actually. Why Greenland is not colored in here. And I mentioned that before, the Arctic still remains a niche policy to the European Union, despite all these linkages they have up there, despite climate change, despite environmental issues and economic opportunities. And the question we always ask policymakers, both in the north but also in Brussels, does the EU Arctic role actually matter to the circumpolar north or not? And also vice versa in Brussels, like, what do you really want from the Arctic? What's the goal you're following, or what's the objectives you have up there, you know? I mean, and yeah, the answers are always very broad, but I'm not really satisfied with these answers. And then, of course, Arctic policy, as I mentioned before, is a nice mixture of both internal and external policy. And when you talk about policy making in Brussels, it's always, of course, an interplay and conflict to some extent, institutional conflicts between the Commission and the member states. You know who has eventual the competence to create a certain policy or be like the leader when it comes to creating certain policies. And you have like policy areas that supranational ones, and then you have ones dominated by the member states. And foreign policy, for example, is a clearly national member states dominated policy area. So the challenging way in creating a policy for a region that is to some extent both outside and inside the Arctic is creating a policy that kind of maybe starts at a national point but becomes more and more supranational, especially when it comes to climate change or environmental issues, which a single member state, a single state cannot deal, cannot solve itself by itself, but needs this a supranational level and needs a strong EU 27 or EU 28, which we still are, you know, like fighting or like combating climate change. So although some member states, even outside the Arctic, have statements on the Arctic and have ideas on what to do with the Arctic still remains what I call here an underdog, a regional underdog in capitals, in European capitals. I mean, the Netherlands has a statement on the Arctic, Germany has a statement, Italy even has a statement, France of course. I think the Spanish are developing one. Poland is very active in Arctic research, so they have ideas about the Arctic. But again, it's not a hot topic in these various capitals neither. And I don't think in the years to come it will become an even hotter topic. The problems are definitely the problems the European Union is facing and will be facing in the future is South and East when it comes to foreign policy issues. And even we often talk about climate change in the Arctic. Yes, climate change is happening in the Arctic, but you can only combat climate change outside the Arctic. The pollution doesn't happen in the Arctic. It happens here in the US, it happens in Europe, it happens in Asia. And of course it has a direct effect in the Arctic region, but you don't have the heavy polluters up north. You have them somewhere else. So climate change also needs to be fought somewhere else. But the effects of climate change and adapting to climate change, that's something that needs to happen in the north, and where the EU wants to spend a lot of money. So, as I said, another point, different views on Arctic engagement. A couple of member states don't care at all, simply put as that. I mean, Austria definitely has some Arctic researchers, but doesn't have an Arctic policy and will never have an Arctic policy. And then you have some states that care, and then of course you have Finland, Sweden, who are very much interested in Denmark in Arctic issues. But a common point all states have together is, of course, they're supporting the EU becoming an Arctic Council observer. If that will ever happen in the near future, it's another story. But again, there's of course some institutional disputes over how to or what the EU should do in the Arctic, but there's a common stance that of course the EU should be part, Brussels should be part in Arctic politics and should be an active partner up north, and the member states are supporting that. The last more policy-related slide I have is here. Okay, Quo Vadis Arctic? What will happen in Brussels when it comes to Arctic policy in the near future? Last year and this year was a rather quiet year when it comes to Arctic issues. For example, the European Commission issued their last Arctic policy statement back in 2016, and afterwards they said that will be our last Arctic statement for a couple of years now. So it's rather quiet right now in Brussels when it comes to Arctic issues. This year I have dealt a lot with the so-called snow crab issue around the archipelago of Svalbard, or in German, or maybe more commonly known as Spitsbergen, where both Norway and the European Union are fighting over the potential of snow crab fishing, which is again interesting for an Austrian as me, coming from a landlocked country, dealing with fisheries issues. But yeah, a couple of articles I've written with a good friend of mine together that will be published hopefully soon. It's quite interesting on how fisheries and how few small actors, especially in the parliament, can dominate a small issue like snow crab fisheries, and then which to some extent has an impact on the EU's overall Arctic policy and their foreign policy goals in the Arctic. An oil-gas moratorium is popping up every other month in the European Parliament, again with some members saying there should be no drilling in the Arctic whatsoever. Finland has just taken over the chairmanship of the Arctic Council, which is a rotating chairmanship. Every 2 years it's changing, so Finland has just taken it over last year. The European Commission is part of the group that negotiates on blocking fishing in the Arctic high seas, so around the North Pole, which so far there's a moratorium on that fishing, and the EU Commission has been part of that group of states dealing with that. And of course, funding is always a big issue. Next year there will be a new funding period starting in Brussels, which always lasts for 7 years. And of course, there's a lot of discussions about how much money do we spend on issues related to the Arctic, research, climate change, whatever. And a question I always end, as I said before, presentations or discussions with EU policymakers in Brussels, again, what does the Arctic mean for the European Union? And the answers are, again, always broad and always unclear, but we'll keep on asking. I have 2 other slides that's maybe a bit trying to explain the academic and research idea behind the book and behind my PhD, trying to bring together political geography with political science. And as mentioned before, both my professors and other academics in political science said you cannot use geopolitics as a theory or as a concept to explain EU foreign policy making, because the EU is not a geopolitical actor. Contrary to that, political geography and geographers say the EU is a geopolitical actor. It's currently a geopolitical subject in the making. So it has some kind of geopolitical identity. There's a geopolitical discourse in Brussels. So you can frame the EU as being a geopolitical actor. And that was the entire idea behind the PhD. And the idea was then, okay, if the EU is a geopolitical subject in the making, how can you actually explain that making, and what makes the EU a geopolitical actor? And I found a really interesting framework by a political geographer who says there are 4 points that make the EU, or makes the EU in a certain region or on a big picture a geopolitical actor, and that's what we named here the circulation of geopolitical ideas, the production of geopolitics, governance at a distance, and technologies of geopolitics. And we created a nice little, difficult to understand, they call it table map about the EU as a geopolitical subject in the Arctic. Again, these 4 points: the circulation of geopolitical ideas, governance at a distance, technologies that help to be and to remain a geopolitical subject or actor, and the production of geopolitics. I think the most interesting part is the left side part, because it deals a lot with EU Arctic policy and these various documents. I mentioned before the 10 documents, and it's a lot about discourse and narratives and like, okay, how does the EU see certain developments in the Arctic? How do they talk about them? How do they narrate them? And like, how do policymakers in Brussels talk about these issues? And what's the idea behind? And that's what I call the moral language and the geopolitical ideas. And these are the 5 main ones I found in the various documents. And when talking to EU policymakers, it's like, how do we in Brussels perceive ourselves when it comes to foreign policy? And a lot of talk is, of course, like the EU is the sustainability manager. We know how to deal with sustainable development. We can help you guys in the north, for example, on becoming even more sustainable. Similar when it comes to leader in climate change, you know. Ever since the Kyoto Protocol, the Commission in Brussels is very strong on EU being the climate change leader and being the dominant actor globally when it comes to climate change. And that kind of like evolves a bit into what I call the governance, stabilizer, and enhancer. Like based on the idea that Europe or the European Union brought peace to Europe, we try to like bring that into the world. You know, we are a stabilizer when it comes to governance issues, and when we can bring peace to regions, and we can, if you're part of the bigger European community or bigger European idea, you will automatically be like live in a peaceful era, at least a peaceful time. And that was especially in the beginning of the Arctic, what I mentioned, you know, a potential for a new Cold War, and the disputes between the various states up there, or potential disputes. The thinking in Brussels, we could bring peace up there, we could help you guys not create an unstable era. So this, along this, or based on that table or map or whatever you call it, I tried to explain that the EU is a geopolitical subject and can be framed as a geopolitical actor, despite not having military, which normally defines, is part of a key definition of what defines a geopolitical actor. But yeah, this is a very academic approach to it. What did my professor say that during my defense, that I can't really like be against what you said, because it is true, you can frame it as a geopolitical actor, but what's the next step? And I think that could be an interesting next research idea, you know, okay, even if you frame it as a geopolitical actor, what comes next, you know, what is the, it's only a starting point, as research always is, you know, even if you think you're done with research, it's just a starting point for another. All right, I think I talked quite a lot. That's it.
Okay.
Thanks a lot for hosting me here.